Hey and well met. I'm Robin Artisson. I'm a fairy traditionalist, a co-member of the An Carow Gwyn, and Pendraig of the Dragon Kinship. And it's another behind the scenes. We are doing the audiobook for An Carow Gwyn by Robin Artisson. Now, I'm not sure how long my cell phone is going to work because it decided to unplug during the night and I am slowly trickle charging it. So that's kind of fun. Not. As I record, there's going to be times where we can stop and discuss if there's any questions or comments. And even if we're not live, and you have any questions, comments, or ideas, do not be afraid to leave so down below in the YouTube video. Sinuses. But if you wish to continue to support this endeavor, I do have a GoFundMe for a new temple. There is the little short link and stuff for the GoFundMe. I do accept PayPal, of course, and if you would like any of my services, tarot readings, mentoring, stuff like that, that is the best way to go ahead and send funds if you're not a member of the Patreon that I have, which is where most of these videos are going to be held. So if you miss any week or any video or any of the stuff, my Patreon is the best place to find it. Every 3 weeks or so, I put videos behind the paywall, mostly because of copyright issues and the like. This is kind of a fundraiser itself to replace my temple. As you see, it has seen better days. But let's go ahead and open up our software so we can figure out exactly where we were. Okay, let's go open. We want ACT Draft 1. And let me figure out where we were. Oh, we are on my use of the word fairy. Yay. Didn't have to go very far to look for it, did we? I try to make sure that I stop at a easy to find spot. But let's go ahead and see about beginning. My use of the word fairy. While our word fairy may descend from the strangest and most traditional of places, the modern day has not been kind to it. Popular culture and media, themselves reacting to earlier caricaturing of fairies, have reduced the seriousness and spiritual dignity of the word and the beings to which it refers. What was once an ancient spirit the people held in awe became a demon that people held in pious dread. And then the demon became an iconic feature of the wallpaper of children's rooms. In the present age of Tinkerbell and tiny tinsel-winged pixies, the word fairy is most often encountered with speaking of fairy tales, themselves associated in the mainstream mind with sentimental fantasy, whimsicality, childishness, and falsehood. Fantasy stories and settings typically portray fairies as a species of supernatural butterfly or tiny winged pests. There is no way to overcome the cultural damage done to the word fairy, nor reverse its sad evolution into a fantasy creature that bears no connection to its spiritual and tangible reality. Some people rightly point out that fairies in the deep lore are presented, at times, as small. Even the fairies of Selena Moore are presented so. This is far from an anthropological description of fairies. Being spirits, fairies can appear in many shapes and forms and assume many sizes. Otherworldly space, like otherworldly time, as we shall see, is a thing at odds with the ordinary experience of space and time. To the dead, as to spirits, time makes little human sense, and size is also a very fluid or potentially meaningless thing. Fairies in lore are depicted in all sizes. Their typical size, in the eyes of fairy folklore, often depends on the geographical region that the fairy lore stems from. Certain regions of England regularly see their fairies depicted as diminutive, while in Ireland they are often depicted as human-sized, or even taller than humans, and more majestic. The dead are often depicted in folk beliefs around the world as small. This may be because the dead are seen to sink down to the underworld or to a deeper condition. Clumps of moss in certain Eastern European nations were described as forests for both spirits and dead people. But the diminished size of fairies likely has other origins. When a belief system is diminished in the face of a new religion or creed, the beings who inhabit that belief system can become viewed over time as less powerful, as exiled, or as simply wasted away. The fairy smallness in Britain can be a cultural perspective that places the fairy tradition and all its native inhabitants in a diminished cultural space and a space of diminished belief, thus yielding the aesthetic of shrunken spirits or beings who, once powerful, have become imps. At any rate, fairies are not small. Spirits are not small. They may be experienced in a vision or dream as small, or choose to appear small, but size is not a quality of spirits. They do not have coarse or tangible bodies of flesh that are locked into certain heights due to the conditioning of genetics or gravity and other coarse natural forces of the human world. And fairies are not cute, sweet, funny, doltish, or any of the other non-threatening and further diminishing layers they have absorbed from modern culture. Fairies or spirits are just as the ancestors said. They are enchanted entities and meshed with subtle layers of fateful force, able to wield preternatural abilities. They are ambiguous and potentially dangerous to humans who are not respectful. I see no point in struggling to rehabilitate the word fairy. I do believe, however, that using a more archaic spelling of the word avoids much of the modern baggage that is collected around it. I favor the old rendering, fairy, Fayrie, for many reasons. When pronounced fairy, it avoids the peer sound and thus the instant foolish connotations of the modern term. When spelled out on paper, it avoids the simple sight of the blighted word fairy, Fairy. It makes people stop and think for a moment, and that brief moment of curiosity can make all the difference in the world. From this point on, I shall be using the spelling fairy, Fayrie, in this book. I will be using it for all the reasons I gave here, but also because I've used it for many years before I set about the task of creating this work. It has become a part of my interior lexicon. Using Feeri makes me feel apart from the modern day's mangling of the term and its condescension or disbelief for the sublime spiritual realities behind and within it. It reminds me, every time I write it or say it, of the seriousness and venerable age of what I do and believe. The fairy typology and characteristic behavior motifs. Having focused on the core reality and origin of the fairy people in the ancient cult of the dead, I will now turn to the other cultural and historical factors that have fed into the animistic vision of the fairy faith. Fairy, as a name given to the spirit world or the unseen, is shown to be populated by an enormous variety of sentient beings that are encountered in our myths and folk tales in many shapes. At one time or another, they have all been called fairies. It is crucial to remember that fairy has many shades of usage. It can mean different things depending on the context in which it is used. It can be a general term, just like spirit, but it can also refer to the unseen world, as well as to the post-mortem existence of a deceased human being. It can, as we shall see, also be used to refer to the fairy people as a distinctive race, a metaphysical category of being, to faithful and very much non-human powers, as well as to many categories of nature spirits. I will endeavor to give a short typology, a list of the kinds of entities that have come to dwell under the folkloric and traditional umbrella of fairy. Then, I will work to construct a list of behavior motifs, which offer us a way to partially comprehend the range of ways the fairy beings have interacted with humans and our world when they were encountered or sensed by pre-modern people, as well as more than a few modern people. Any attempt to set a typology or make a list of motifs regarding spirit entities and the spirit world is necessarily limited. It's always a small taste of an overview. The vastness of forms and interactions between this world and the other, and between sentient beings and other beings, is beyond our ability to comprehend. We only hope to gain what measure of insight we can through exercises like this, which may help us or edify us in future situations. The fairy race. When fairy beings are considered in terms of the post-mortem existence of human beings, there may be a tendency to assume that the deceased human being simply occupies the unseen world, maintaining their personality, appearance, and character from life. While some of the formerly human entities that occupy the fairy world may appear that way to friends and family after their deaths, this might be understood as a form of glamour, or as a decision made on the part of the former human, assuming they have the power or ability to manifest themselves in a comprehensible or non-threatening way. Death means the loss of the breath soul, which we will discuss soon, and the disintegration or scattering of most of the souls or metaphysical portions that make up the living human person as they are ordinarily encountered in the breathing world. There is a disintegration followed by reintegrations in new shapes or relationships. Death is therefore a very potent transformation, a powerful metamorphosis into the fairy state, and the dead are seldom just as their living relatives remember them. They are fairy now, and no longer human. In the same way that fairy beings are the outcomes of death metamorphosis on the parts of human beings are somehow an outcome of another kind of transformation for fairy beings. This implies that what we call the human race has a hidden pole or aspect and a hidden history, which is fairy. The fairy aspect of humanity may be its primary aspect. It may be the way our entities exist in the long or timeless periods between brief periods of human life, the relatively short periods in which we gain breath souls and, with the aid of human mothers, express our entities as humans. In this conjectural sense, the fairy race may be the only true race. Humanity, along with many other breathing creatures that share our life world, may all be extensions of the fairy race, perhaps spontaneous organic side effects of its larger, deeper, and more timeless existence. This is not to suggest that the fairy reality being primary means that the ordinarily encountered world of breathing sensual life is somehow a less real or less important reality. The two worlds or conditions of experience, seen and unseen, are completely enmeshed, intercreative, and mutually substantial. Whatever is taken away from all this, we must remember that the fairy dead are not merely the ghosts or shades of dead humans. Ghost more specifically refers to a lost soul, a soul that has not been able to undergo the natural transition into whatever states lie beyond the boundaries of its natural life. Shade refers to the visionary experience of an entity that seems to have the appearance of a dead person, or the sometimes circulated belief that an echo or an egoless copy of a dead person can survive their death and maintain their appearance somehow. Tutelary spirits. Fairy folklore presents two kinds of entities who act as tutelary spirits to human beings. By tutelary spirits, I mean entities that characteristically or regularly render compassion and aid to human beings. The first type of tutelary spirit is the follower, also called the fetch follower or the co-walker. Though they are sometimes simply called a fetch, it is important to note that fetch can refer to a spiritually projected subtle body or psychic copy of a living person as well. Followers are entities that appear to be linked to the birth, life, death, and destiny of a living man or woman. They are connected to a breathing human throughout life, and though they typically remain unseen throughout a life, they work to protect the human being they are connected to. For ordinary people, the first sighting of the fetch follower is typically shortly before they die, when this entity departs briefly from them to go and get their place ready in the unseen before returning to guide them away from this life and into the next. Thus, having a vision of the follower is a standard folkloric omen for approaching death. The follower would seem to be the same as the Old Norse Fylgja, and it can assume an animal shape as well as a human one. It is the source of an individual's luck and somehow mediates their destiny to them. Its chief service, aside from spiritual protection through life, is to act as a psychopomp in death. Children who die in infancy or childhood were seen in certain primal cultures to lack the protection of a strong follower, and those adults in everyday life who suffer from ill fortunes like accidents or diseases are thought to have followers who could not, for whatever reason, warn them or shield them from the dreadful fate-related circumstances that cause those things, or from the predatory spirits who bring about illness. Witches and sorcerers often gain their chief power from identifying with the fetch follower long before dying. This is a reversal of the natural flow of relationship between the human and the follower, and represents a potent spiritual transformation, albeit an unnatural one, for those who manage to gain this condition. To discover the identity of the follower, learning its name, its faces or forms, and consciously relating with it many years before a person dies, is to become witched and capable of a potent alliance with a spirit that is very loyal and connected to one's person. This special relationship can render many acts of sorcery possible and more powerful. The majority of human beings will not obtain this condition in life. Ordinarily, it requires a powerful entity, such as the fairy king or queen, to bestow the special experience upon a person. Legends of witches having familiars bestowed upon them in initiatory encounters with the devil are likely born in the reality of a powerful, otherworldly spirit creating this awareness of the follower in men and women who were granted the power to become sourcelessly active. Great traumas or other extraordinary spiritual experiences can sometimes awaken the awareness of the identity of the follower and allow a man or woman to begin relating to it consciously before death. The follower, in its human shape, may also be one of the main underlying realities behind the encounter with the fairy bride or fairy husband. The fetch can act as a mate to the human it is connected with, appearing in erotic dreams at different times during life, or acting as a lover to the soul. The follower's sexual unions represent powerful transformations for the man or woman in this mythical and folkloric motif of connubial relations between the human and other than human world. The follower, in its protective and guiding role, may also underlie the later belief in guardian angels. Though it remains concealed throughout a human's breathing life, the follower can still send warning or guiding dreams, intuitive feelings of danger, and other meaningful signs to the man or woman it is attempting to protect and guide. It is clear that the follower's connection to a man or woman is likely of an ancestral nature. This would satisfyingly explain the selfless and patient lengths to which the follower goes to aid and protect the human person. In this view, the follower is an ancestral spirit who, for reasons of love or compassion, decides to help a kin being who is about to be born as a human by protectively accompanying them through the life experience. Other machinations and enmeshments of power and circumstance could bind one being to another in this duty, but the ancestral explanation still carries the simplest explanatory power. Certain tutelary spirits can attach themselves to entire families, serving or protecting the family as a whole, instead of just an individual. The most obvious example of this from the relevant lore is the Banshee, a spirit woman who sings, cries, or weeps in such a way that family members can hear her before a tragedy strikes the family, or as an omen that a member of the family is about to die. Her name reveals her fairy nature very clearly. Banshee means woman of the hill, and is a reference to the fairy hills or burial mounds below which the ancestral dead sleep. Her storied connection to whole families may be a continuation of an earlier belief that certain of each family's ancestral female spirits watched, guided, and protected the family in this world. The second kind of tutelary spirit, most commonly encountered in the lore, is the domestic spirit, or the house spirit, which goes by many names. It is often called a brownie, a hob, or a hobgoblin in Britain. The notion that a house can be indwelled by a spirit or spirits is as old as the construction of the first permanent houses themselves. When human beings first created permanent houses, they had to deal with the spiritual realities of the places in which they were building those dwellings. Every place in the world is already occupied by spirit forces. To place a house in a location to make a permanent change to the area is to risk the wrath of spirits who already dwell there and who may not desire human intrusion. If spirits were amenable, it was natural that the spirits of the land who were there before would move in or integrate themselves with the structure of the home and its new inhabitants, becoming a new kind of social group. So, house spirits originally, and even today, were pre existing nature spirits that became enmeshed in the new human activity of creating and inhabiting permanent houses. Over time, when humans lived and died in houses for generations, connections between the house, the family, and ancestral spirits were made too. And thus, the ancestral element of house spirit ecology became a reality. Today, as in the past, the tutelary spirits of houses can be ancestors, pre existing land or nature spirits, who have incorporated themselves into the structure and living spaces, or both. They appear in fairy lore as protective presences in the house, but also as helpful presences in a more direct way. They may perform chores or housework. They are most typically honored with bowls of cream and cakes left at their most sacred place since ancient times, the hearth of the home. To honor the house spirit was to invite prosperity and safety onto the home. To enrage it or ignore it was to invite accident or disaster. The house spirit would cause disaster in exchange for outrages likely wouldn't be an ancestral presence connected to the people living in the house. As with the follower I discussed above, ancestral spirits tend to be more compassionate and patient with their still living human families. But an ancient spirit, older than humanity, who had indwelled a certain place in a forest since the dawn of the forest's time, and who later saw the trees cleared and a house built right in its place, that spirit could be more hard nosed. If the first people who lived in the house really honored that spirit, it could come to expect continued attention and offerings. The first people who lived in such a world would have needed to make due honors to these spirits. It is debatable that any of the first houses built could have lasted more than a few weeks or months without the propitiated peace of those ancient powers. The image of the hob or the hobgoblin, collectively sometimes referred to as hobmen, certainly calls to mind pre-human nature spirits. They tend to be depicted as bestial, horned, or partially animal, partly human. They are connected to pucks and to the bukas, bucks, pukas, or fukas, who were all shapeshifters of great ability and assumed animal forms. The names Hob and Puck are also names given to the folkloric devil himself. We can surmise in all of this that the Hob spirits are a grouping of nature spirits, especially connected to the land and to the king of spirits himself, perhaps daemonic servitors of his and mediators of his blessings and power. The spirit king's association with serpents and snakes, which we will discuss soon, goes a short way towards explaining the ages old connection of the snake with the hearth cult and the hearth spirit. There are endless accounts of relations between human beings and domestic spirits to be found in the annals of fairy folklore. It is clear that the people of the West enjoyed thriving relationships with domestic spirits that occupied houses and farms until the end of two world wars definitively brought an end to the last vestiges of rural lifeway all over America, Britain, Europe, and many other places. What commonly emerges from these accounts of human and spirit relationship are strange taboos that had to be obeyed, lest the domestic spirit or spirits became enraged or simply choose to leave. Those taboos often included a potent command to never thank the fairy entities or give them gifts, particularly gifts of clothing. The passive leaving out of a bowl of cream or cakes or other such offerings was permitted, which they would take without question. But to thank them for their services or favors is commonly forbidden. And stories show how malicious these spirits can become if they are thanked, or if the human beings involved try to offer them gifts. For a long while, I wondered at the origin of these peculiar taboos. In a spiritual ecological context, which is as old as the hills, the notion of being fairly reciprocal with spirits, showing gratitude to them, and giving them offerings or gifts is common. Animistic societies and communities around the world regularly shower spirits with gratitude offerings or gifts in the course of daily and seasonally relating to them. So, why the warnings in the fairy tradition? I originally considered that perhaps the power to say thank you and to bestow gifts might could be seen as the duty of a lord or master to a faithful subject, and that fairy beings who are enmeshed members of a household would despise being treated as underlings. I considered that the giving of gifts might invoke ancient laws of indebtedness that defied the more organic and open spontaneity of simple kindness. I no longer subscribe to these notions, as I shall mention soon in more detail. I think that these cultural taboos represent the influence of Christian culture more than anything. These taboos are, in my mind, best and most simply explained as taboos designed to stop humans from entering into the older dimension of spirit reverence and spirit worship that the early Christian church fought so hard to eradicate. They could not eradicate spirits, least of all the domestic spirits, but they could set in place cultural norms and rules that forbade any kinds of activities that seemed too worshipful or friendly towards spirits, and forbid or warn against acts that strayed too close to the making of spirit offerings. Over time, stories of humans being foully assaulted by fairy entities angry about being thanked, or who turned malicious upon being given gifts, would make sense in terms of social disencouragement of the older ways of spirit worship. The presentation of these intimate house dwelling fairy beings as nightmarishly capricious and cruel or unpredictable helps round out this kind of subtle social propaganda. For years, I have genuinely thanked and given gifts to the hobs of many hearths and homes, and I have yet to be subjected to their sadistic rage or neglect. Take a small break there, my poor throat. Diminished and forgotten gods. It is everywhere obvious that the gods and goddesses of pre Christian people often ended up viewed as fairy entities in latter ages. When pagan cultures were cast down and transformed by the new Christian culture, gods and goddesses from older times sank to the lower regions of cultural awareness and prestige. They often underwent demonization, which rapidly places them in the ranks of lower and dangerous spirits, which is precisely how the fairy entities were depicted in later times. Still, the hallmarks of the former godly status of some of these beings is very clear. In many cases, the local gods of local tribes or cultural units might end up being styled as a kind of royalty in the fairy world. Their new homes, below the ground, might also have been the homes they always had in earlier underworld or otherworld traditions. The god and goddess who were specifically considered the rulers of the underworld by a particular pagan culture might undergo very little change in the course of their fairy translation. The king and queen of fairy are regularly classically glossed as Pluto and Proserpine in old works. This is a key point. Entities who were gods in a previous cultural time did not magically become fairies. They were always fairy entities, always powerful spirit beings. What changed was the cultural understanding and cultural language used to refer to them. In this, we must remember that fairy and daemon and spirit are always interchangeable terms in the metaphysical sense. In the pagan period, a god or a goddess was simply a very powerful spirit being whose public cult of worship had become culturally influential and was ordinarily of great age. Those entities who were the god and goddess of the underworld for a certain culture are not suddenly transformed into the fairy king and queen after ages of Christianity. They were always that. To destroy the public and cultural influence that the cult of a god or goddess had is not to destroy the entity itself, which once enjoyed that status and worship. Though, from the perspective of culture and history, it is very clear that the spirit's power in the human social world is diminished greatly. Their power in the natural world, their power in the full sense of the word, continues unabated. Their legendary continues on a new cultural stage, and their presence still shines through the dark cracks of fairy folklore and folk tale. It is clear in many old tales that the gods of previous cultural times will retreat willingly, or be forced, into the underworld or into the unseen world to take up new homes apart from the human world that they were once more closely inhabited or influenced. This is a way that human beings dealt with the psychic trauma of seeing ancestral beings and older cultural arrangements banished due to newer cultural transformations. The old ways and the old entities had to be relocated to a still existing metaphysical region, and whether they were reviled or respected from afar, they still had a presence. In this way, many of the older gods and goddesses of myth and legend might be met by wanderers in the fairy world or in the unseen. They might still exert their special quality of presence in other ways. In this manner, the entire fund of pagan myth and many historical pagan cultures transmitted a potent layer to the fairy faith, which is very deep and crucial. Nature spirits. In the same manner that pagan gods and goddesses became culturally diminished and then remembered in fairy terms, local spirits who indwelled landforms and other natural phenomenon also ended up peopling the fairy world and fairy folklore. When most modern people think of pagan religion, they center their thinking on the well-known historical cults of the major gods and goddesses, without understanding that much of pagan religious life was oriented around smaller cults to local land and nature spirits and ancestral veneration. All three of these categories of pagan religious activity, godly cults, local spirit cults, and ancestral cults, often deeply enmeshed and overlapped in many places. A nature spirit, the indweller of a local mountain or forest, for example, could have been venerated as an ancestor and over time elevated to godly status as a new cultural and political realities emerged. Nature spirits, as a category, should be seen to include the indwelling persons or entities of trees, plants, stones, rivers, springs, lakes, ponds, mountains, hills, meadows, winds, and even animals. When we speak of the indwelling person of an oak tree, we are speaking of a singular entity. A hill or region of hills, or a valley, or a field may be indwelled by a single dominant entity or a collective of many entities. We are forced to think of nature here as the realms of things outside of, apart from, or distant from human artifice. If we did not make this distinction, we would be unable to use nature as a category for anything, for it would swallow up everything. Nature is the suprasystem of life and interaction that encompasses all things. Here, we will consider nature as the regions and aspects of that system of life that are sufficiently distant from what man has built with his own hands. Fairy folklore is packed with references to spiritual forces and persons that clearly indwell the natural phenomenon that I have listed before, and which make reference to encounters with beasts and animals that are extraordinary in nature. It's clear that the original animism of the first human beings is on distant display in this kind of folklore. The animism that extends from the dawn of human cultural time is the primordial layer, the bedrock that the fairy faith is established upon and rooted within. A folk song from Somerset discusses the character of the spirit persons who indwell various kinds of trees. It says, Elum do grieve, oak he do hate, willow do walk, if you travels late. The old folk believed that if an elm tree was cut down, its neighbor elms would weep for it and could even die of grief themselves. The oak spirit has for ages been associated with strength and power, and its lively, aggressive spirit is a survivor. Shoots of a new oak can spring up even from a stump that remains when an oak is felled. But when a new group of oaks grows up after being cut down, they are said in some tales to hate human beings, and that forest can become hostile. To pass through that regrown forest at night could be very dangerous. The willow, creepily, was believed to follow travelers at night, if not the physical tree, then its wandering spirit. The elder tree occupies an endlessly deep compartment of folklore, with her indwelling person seen as a particularly powerful, otherworldly presence, making her practically the witch of the tree world. She was as associated with death as the birch was with beginnings. Cradles could and should be made of birchwood, but never elder. To take elder wood from a living elder tree without reciting a very special spell, which I call the Green Pact, was to risk death or torment at the hands of the offended elder spirit. The spell went like this. Old gal, give me some of thy wood, and I shall give thee some of mine when I grow into a tree. The simple display of reciprocity between the human world and the unseen world here is magnificent. The human man or woman offers their own essence to the elder tree in return for her essence. Give of me now, and I will give of you of me later, is the basic idea. But for a human to say, when I grow into a tree, is curious. It is a deep reference to the dead body of the human decaying in the ground and becoming food for plants and trees. We are seeing a hidden reference to the belief in what some folklores call a plant soul, a portion of a human being that extends from the human relationship with the green and growing world, which we will talk about in detail very shortly. Some part of the human will become vegetable-like in death, and the living essence of this dead human will contribute to the world of plants and trees. It's being offered to the spirit of the elder tree in exchange for her wood. This is a union embracing life and death, the human offering a portion of his or her own vitality from the deepest level to the indweller of the elder tree. That the elder would rate such respect and special consideration, even in such a late historical period, clearly speaks to the power and veneration its spirit enjoyed in earlier cultures. The spells found throughout the ancient world for charming or swaying the spirits of plants to obtain their help upon harvesting their parts is a continuation of a consistent and old veneration of the spirits of these beings. The fairy beings from folklore who are associated with animal shapes bring us to another strain of fairy folklore, which display the primordial or animistic marks I mentioned before. The Kelpie spirit, who appears as a charming little horse that rushes into a body of water to drown anyone that climbs upon its back, represents a kind of predatory spirit indwelling bodies of water. The Selkie spirit, who appears to be able to assume the form of a human woman or a seal, is a less malignant example of a water-related spirit or fairy. The Selkie woman represents another example of human and otherworldly intercourse, or inner exchange between the fairy and human worlds that we will discuss in great detail in Chapter 4. Selkie women were reputed to become wives to human beings and to become ancestresses to families that have otherworldly marks to their bloodline. But to keep the Selkie woman in this world, as with other such beings, usually proves to be impossible, for when she discovers her seal skin, which her human husband invariably had to find and hide from her, to coerce her into staying in this world, she vanishes away. The Gurach Anun, the wives from below, or the women from the underworld, are, in my mind, the best example of female-appearing fairy beings who are associated with bodies of water. Bodies of water are universally seen as gateways into the underworld, interface points of great power. In Wales, the Gurach Anun are spirits from the underworld who quite often married themselves into human families, pursuant to contracts made between those human families and the powers below. They bring prosperity and other blessings to the family, but they come with certain taboos, particularly taboos against any violence ever being directed towards them. The physicians of Mythfa in Wales were famous for their extraordinary healing abilities throughout the Middle Ages and up until their family tradition died out in the 19th century. They were taught their healing ways by a fairy woman, one of the Gureth Anun, who was her ancestress. Most folklorists place the Gureth Anun in the category of water-related nature fairy, but to me, they represent a general term for the women of the otherworld, who appear in numberless accounts as the white women or pale women who guard wells or springs, or who might become fairy brides to human beings. The appearances of fairy hounds and dogs are everywhere common, and in some places, even fairy cats. The serpentine lake monsters that emerged from folklore and even modern culture, continuing this common association with watery places in the fairy world, also descend from the core animism of the fairy faith. Most modern people think of the Loch Ness monster as a modern cryptozoological phenomenon, but the first recorded encounter with the Loch Ness monster, a dragon or serpent monster in the River Ness, is from the 6th century CE. Almost every country today seems to produce sightings of lake monsters. Some may be tourist traps, but the motif of a water serpent or water dragon in a lake is very ancient. And the association of dragons and serpents with the deeper and most fundamental power of life and the life force in the land is likewise ancient. Loch Ness was created mythically when a serving woman of the mighty Cathliac giantess named Nessa forgot to close a sacred well and flooded part of the land. Nessa was transformed into the spirit of the lake. Nessa, as with many of the named entities in these kinds of stories, was likely a powerful local spirit or goddess, once venerated in ancient times at Loch Ness, almost certainly the indwelling spirit of that lake. The Caithliac herself, as we shall see, is a reflex of the mightiest entity, the earth indweller, the queen of spirits. All of these stories of fairy beings or spirits that some try to call nature spirits create another thread in a dense tapestry of spiritual ecology. Those who insist on a simple or singular explanation for fairy beings say, how can fairies be the spirits of dead humans when the spirit of that boulder over there or the spirit of that lake over there is older than humanity? When the dead are merged with the land, when they transition into the fairy reality, they become a part of the tapestry of unseen powers. Further transformations can easily relocate them into indwelling a tree, or a boulder, or a lake, along with many other powers. Subsequent mysterious movements can reposition them in nearly any tangible or metaphysical location, though the dead within graves or mounds have a stabilizing factor aiding their connection to a single place. The dead in general might be encountered through many phenomena, from dreams and visions to trees and bodies of water. This mind bending reality of spiritual fluidity and transformation is at the heart of fairyism, as with animistic worldviews in general. Not all spirits are the transformed spirits of formerly breathing humans or animals, but many can be, including the ancient spirits of places like groves, lakes, hills, or forests. When the human Tam Lin was taken by the fairy world, he was later encountered by breathing humans as the guardian spirit of the forest at Karaha. We must simply remember that there is an overlap between entities of all kinds in the strangeness and fluidity of the unseen world. And I'm going to stop there. It's almost been my required hour of recording. My throat hurts, and we've already covered a lot of ground. That was fun. I love recording An Carow Gwyn. I love passing on what I've learned from this remarkable tome of work. And I really, 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 really do hope that you enjoy this audiobook when it comes out. And I'm doing my best to record quality sound. Eventually, I got to go through and edit all the crappy stuff out, like my coughing and stuff like that, mispronunciation, stuff like that. But this book, you see, for anyone who understands the story of the white stag, they know that when the white stag appears, something big usually happens. Not that long after this book was published, and not that long after I took my oath of belonging as a fairy traditionalist, it's been 6 years, and as of the 13th of this month, 1 extra month since I took my oath of belonging. Not that long after began the pandemic. Not that long after a co-religionist in the fairy tradition wrote her book, The White Deer, we started having issues with Christian nationalism being on the rise. Every time the white stag appears, something big happens. So I want you to ponder that. Think about that. Has this specific white stag, this book, An Carow Gwyn, changed your life? And how so? If it has, please share your fairy tale with me. For my life is nothing but a big freaking fairy tale. Some of it is beautiful, awe-inspiring. Some of it is scary, dangerous even. But that's the true story about real fairy tales. It's not all sunshine and roses and rainbows. There's deep, dark things out there. But when you begin to open yourself to the rhizome that is the seen and unseen realm in your everyday existence, you'll be amazed that they are still here. the good neighbors are still here and have never left. We've left them. We've left them behind in our capitalism, in our materiality, in our modern religions, and in our social structures. We have turned our back frequently. And sometimes those fateful forces have to do fateful things. I truly think the pandemic was a huge worldwide tide to hell. And I mean that in the sense of a great amount of lives were lost and are going to be lost, not just from the pandemic, but from other stuff that's coming up. This is mankind's payment for what has been taken. A great ravishing hunger that gnaws at the deepest pits of our souls and our hearts and our minds. And I truly believe An Carow Gwyn and the other works that Robin and many others have put out are vital for humanity to wisen up, to really take a look and make some needful changes. And so I hope you enjoy this audiobook when it comes out. And that you listen and you ponder. Like I listen and I ponder and I read and I study and I observe. Wisdom and praxis. Well, with that in mind, if you wish to help support this, become a Patreon patron, or go to my GoFundMe. Anyone who donates to the GoFundMe or requires any of my services, your name is automatically going to be held in memorial when I do get this building built. And rituals and offerings on your behalf will be done very frequently by myself, by the Dragon Kinship, of which I am a co-member, as well as by my own family. So with that in mind, may you never hunger, may you never thirst, may the good neighbors always be with you. Blessed be.